So I guess one of the questions then is, well, then what's next? I mean, we've had this summit, we've got this statement. And again, even though we hosted it and Christendom was so honored and grateful that people came together here to be part of our community for a few days, this is much, much bigger than Christendom. So what are the next steps?
If I can answer that question by, kind of addressing something that you just said that was so important. And this was like, you had to be there to see this, how unified the attendees were. And I was kind of nervous coming in. You propose a joint statement. It's like, this thing could crash and burn. If you get 10 people out of 50 that want to sign it, it's over. That's not enough for consensus. Right. Land O'Lakes had 26, and they all signed it. So you don't need a lot of people, but you do need consensus. And by the end of day 2, the discussions were so animated and so positive. Everyone who could sign the statement signed it.
Welcome to Christendom Conversations. Together we'll explore the wisdom of the Catholic intellectual tradition, engage with thought-provoking ideas, and uncover deep insights into the perennial questions. We're thrilled to have you with us. Let's dive into today's conversation. Well, it's a great pleasure to welcome Dr. Jon Kirwan to this Christendom Conversation. You've been with us before. We've had a conversation before, but this time we're going to talk a bit about something that happened here in Front Royal just a few weeks ago. And it was a big event, and I think it's a historical event in the renewal of Catholic education, primary and secondary education. You're currently leading our Center for Educational Philosophy and Leadership, among other things. But this was an event that reached far beyond Christendom. It was a kind of convening of the leaders of a movement. Can you say a bit about this summit and what took place?
Yeah, well, first of all, Dr. Harne, it's great to see you again. Great to be with you. And I'm really delighted to talk about this because it was such an exciting event. The response was really enthusiastic, and there was quite a bit of momentum that was generated. And the idea came from the felt need to essentially knock down the silos in the renewal of Catholic K-12 education. There's a number of different things going on, a number of players in the space. There's lots of enthusiasm. There's lots of energy, but essentially, there can be a tendency for everybody's off in their own corner doing this or that. So, all right, how do we bring this thing together and help make it a movement if it's not a movement already? And so, first and foremost is knocking down the silos. So we identified 5 different segments, so to say, bishops, superintendents, scholars who are engaged in K-12 educational renewal, executives and leaders in the field who have created and they're running organizations, and then partners, whether that's from the philanthropic space or lawyers who are engaged in educational issues. And we bring them all together for 2 days of working meetings. We're not going to this is not the typical conference where we give academic papers or popular papers, and let's bring everybody together for 2 days of working meetings, developed around strategic priorities. So in order to do this, obviously we had to limit the number. So the idea was, all right, let's cap this at 50. Let's try to get 50 people into the space from all 5 of those different segments. And then we can organize our groups around this. So we had 4 bishops who are all great advocates of educational renewal. We had Archbishop Cordileone, Bishop Daly, Bishop Paprocki, Bishop Fernandez, and each of them they led a working group dedicated to an individual strategic priority. And so this was the idea: is knocking down the silos, bringing everyone together for collaborative discussions.
Yeah. And I will say, I love academic conferences, but I find myself drinking lots of coffee, mainly because I stayed up too late talking to friends and colleagues. Right. But there was no room for napping at this conference. It really was a working event. And it was, I think it was one of the things that was most beautiful about it was people that I've known over the years who work in different areas. Maybe they work in teacher formation, maybe they work on curriculum. Maybe they're leading a nonprofit that supports this renewal. But as far as I know, they've never actually met. They've never actually talked to one another. Yeah. And they were all together in a group that wasn't very large, but it was large. It was significant enough for them to be able to have conversations and contribute, and through a moderator, contribute what their own experience has been over these years, and solve problems. And you could see people put forward ideas and thought, well, what if we did this? And in a good faith, what about this option? And then someone could say, well, we tried this about 5 years ago, and here's what we found out, and here's how it worked, and here were the challenges we faced. And that, in many ways, that saved a lot of these groups from going down a path that had already been investigated. And now they can use their energy doing something else or doing it in a different way. So it was really tremendous to see it all come together. But this working was working towards something. It was working toward this statement, the statement that came out from the summit. Can you say a bit about that?
Right. Well, there's a few things that we wanted to do here. And one of the major things was develop a common statement, a set of shared principles. And every movement of the 20th century begins with some kind of a shared statement. And they usually, since the 60s, they've been naming these statements after the place of discussion and signing. And the reason for this is because it really indicates that this was an event. This is a place where people gathered and they broke bread. They had lively discussions. They read things. They, in some case, fraternally debated things. And they hashed out, all right, what really kind of identifies us as a thing. And so the idea was, okay, let's develop this front royal statement because there's too many disparate elements in faithful Catholic K-12 education. And not only will a set of principles, shared principles, unite them, but also it's an external facing document. All right. Well, how are we presenting ourselves to the world? Right. Rather than being kind of caricatured as well, as this or that or something else. Right. And so this idea of, the 7 cardinal principles of Catholic elementary and secondary education. So the idea of cardinal principles is an old one, and it was used very effectively by the progressive educators in the early years of the 1900s. They developed the 7 cardinal principles of progressive ed. So we kind of tongue-in-cheek took their idea and tried to redeem it. But
the gold of Egypt, as they say.
Yeah, exactly. So then the question is, it's of course we think of Land O'Lakes or even all different sides are using these as a vehicle for putting out their own principles. So then the question is, well, how do you pull this off? And that's the real challenge. These things are always really difficult to get consensus on. When you're inviting all of these high-powered and very successful people to sign on to something, they need to really, there needs to be a real sense of collaboration, that everybody's had buy-in, and there's been a tremendous amount of discussion. And so how do you do this? How do you show up all together when many of these people they've never met? And so the idea was, all right, well, this is going to be a really a long and thorough process. And so first there was a drafting committee, and the drafting committee probably included about a dozen people. There were 7 major drafters, but there was probably 12 hands in it who were all kind of working on things. The 4 bishops were involved. Right. Bishop Daly wrote the preamble. Bishop Conley wrote the introduction. Bishop Paprocki, Archbishop Corleone, they were there. And then there was a range of scholars and practitioners who were really kind of experts in their field. And so the draft was made, and then the committee itself kind of went through the individual drafts. And then the entire draft was sent out to all those who were invited. Right. And then literally hundreds of comments came back. Really, really detailed and thorough comments from especially the scholars and the superintendents. We were really delighted. The bishops took a really active role in this. And it was a really thorough process before we even showed up. And this was the task of is kind of incorporating like scores and scores and scores of really deep comments. Some were light comments, add this word, add that word, but what about this? What about that? So
sure, yeah, well, that's great. So so there was a lot of work beforehand, but it was by a wide variety of people who then later participated in the summit. It's also rooted in the traditional magisterial teaching of the church. I mean, it's not just something that we made up or people made up, over a couple of days. It was something that's really drawing on the tradition, because there are all these footnotes in the document pointing back to magisterial documents.
Right.
Can you say a little bit about that?
Absolutely. Well, I mean, remember, one of the major theological impulses at Vatican II was this idea that we need to be really attentive to church documents, but we don't want to do Denzinger theology. Right. And so one of the most influential books at the council was Yves Congar's The Meaning of Tradition, and he kind of excoriates this approach. Both Thomas and the Communio thinkers were saying, no, this can't be the essence of theology. Right. is merely so. The documents on education are always there as lampposts, but there's the church fathers, the milestones of tradition. We say the church fathers, especially St. Thomas, the liturgy, modern thinkers like who've done great work in education, such as Dawson or Maritain or Pieper. Right. And so there was this idea that we need these broad principles. So, for example, the documents on education, the first modern document we have on education is 1885, Spectata Fides by Leo XIII, which is kind of a short fervorino to the English bishops, kind of keep doing what you're doing, right. Hold the line. Then we get a couple of catechetical documents from Pius X, Pius XI. We have, of course, Divini Ilius, which is the first encyclical. Leo's was also an encyclical, but it was really short. Divini Ilius is the longest, most developed treatment we have. It has a social philosophy involved, the sacraments. It really develops, even in inchoate form, the rights of parents and the duties of Catholic education. Of course, we get to Gravissimum, Vatican II, and then there's a number of post-conciliar documents that develop the Catholic school in 1977, develops essentially Gravissimum. Gravissimum is a much shorter treatment than Divini Ilius, and it focuses on, and it really develops effectively, the freedom of education, the rights of parents, right. The dignity of students, things like that. Well, it leaves a lot unsaid about, what Catholic schools are. Right. And so it developed, 1977 document develops the notion of what is the Catholic school in light of Lumen Gentium. And then we go on and on. John Paul II has a document on catechesis after a synod in the 70s. Benedict is of course putting his stamp on things. Right. Pope Francis is putting his stamp on things. So what we end up with is a myriad of documents that are covering 130 years or something, and well over 100,000 words. I mean, it's a massive, and many different contexts, different theological styles, different weights. We have conciliar documents, encyclicals, we have, right. Synodal exhortation. So there's the task really is not just kind of regurgitating these documents, because
proof texting.
Yeah, proof texting, exactly. Yeah. Because you're not going to get teachers to go to do deep dives into documents. Sometimes you can, but I've spent years and years teaching documents to theology students, and it's like they can only handle a certain amount. Even seminarians can only handle in small bites this or that, this chapter, that chapter.
They're very busy.
So is this idea exactly? Yeah. So this idea of all right, well, if we do principles, right, we're going to kind of bring all of these documents together, right. But without an overabundance or kind of an inundation of footnotes. But we're also going to bring them together with the church, with the great tradition. This is Congar's point: is we need Basil's letter to young men. We need right. the great Christian acquisition of Greek wisdom, Origen at the catechetical school. Hugh of St. Victor writes marvelously on education, right. the rise of the liberal arts. Of course, St. Thomas, Augustine, we can't leave Augustine out. And so, but even beyond that, liturgy, the development of Christian culture, and then, the rise of curricular studies as the church is thinking deeply about, well, what needs to be taught and how do we teach it? Methodology right. is there. So the great, kind of tide of tradition is kind of demands that we give a full accounting of this, but then we also have to put it in a palatable form so that a teacher can read this. You can use it at an in-service, right. or a superintendent can point to this and say, no, like this is what we're doing right here, right? Teachers can't pass out, copies of a magisterial document to parents in most cases and say, well, this is what we're doing, because ecclesiastical documents. There's all kinds of things,
Right.
between the lines that they're doing here and there.
Sure,
right?
sure. Well, and I was in communication with a bishop just at the end of last week who intends to use this statement as the basis for a discussion with his teachers, the Catholic school teachers in
Right.
the diocese.
Right.
So that's exactly, I think, what was hoped for here, is that it's a digestible, it's not too long, it's clearly written, and yet it digests the tradition in a sense and proposes it within a very condensed form that's easily accessible. But the fact that a bishop would take this document and use it as a basis for a discussion with the diocesan Catholic school teachers, that's exactly, I think, what was desired. And there was a wonderful book that came out recently. I think it's called The Most Dangerous Man in England, Newman on the Laity.
Right.
That was Word on Fire published it. And, and it really goes through not only Newman's time with the university, but also his oratory school and all the struggles and the trials and the triumphs of running that school. And he didn't write a whole lot about primary and secondary education. I mean, the documents really are about higher education.
Mm-hmm.
And there's things in letters and other things that are there. But I loved how the spirit of Newman is kind of within this, which is heart speaks to heart, that interpersonal relationship of the teacher and the student. But then also the emphasis on liberal learning, which is very much there in that section on the curriculum. So Newman is present there as well in ways just under the surface for those who know his work. And so it's really just amazing how the document pulls it all together.
Yeah,
in
right.
one place. One thing I wanted to ask you about was the relationship between sort of traditional diocesan schools and private Catholic schools. Because when I look across the room, I saw people who were in all those areas.
Right.
And this seems to be a new thing. There seemed to be a profound disappointment by parents about the failure of diocesan schools, decades ago. They trusted the schools with their kids. Their kids lost their faith. And in response, they started their own schools. And there were many people 20 years ago who were saying that diocesan schools are gone. They're not ever going to come back. And yet there are these bishops that you mentioned that are, in fact, leading renewals within their diocese. And so what we saw at this summit was a combination, it seemed, of the renewal on both fronts, the renewal within the diocesan structures, but also the renewal among the private Catholic schools as well, and a harmony between them and a working together. Can you say a bit about this? Because this seemed new.
Yeah, this is a really important point because, and this is as to go back to, kind of one of the primary ends of this summit was to bring together all of these streams. So, we actually mentioned this in one of the principles, this idea that independent schools need to stay close to their bishop to maintain fidelity,
Right.
And mission integrity. This is important. But likewise, diocesan schools need to, maintain, close adherence to the faith,
Right.
and the principles of authentic Catholic education. But there's also, if we look at the various streams of renewal, right? There's obviously robust liberal education. This idea
Right.
of kind of educating as the church has always done. But there's also gravissimum, accounts for the fact that there might be specialized schools or kind of trade schools or things like this, And so, well, all right. There have been,
Right.
well documented and kind of well publicized Catholic trade schools and more specialized schools. Well, great. They need to also be attentive to not merely pragmatic or utilitarian ends, but also like a really robust Catholic philosophy of education.
Right.
There's homeschoolers, there's independent schools, as you mentioned, who are, need to kind of stay close to the bishop and also kind of, maintain, I think, a robust and fraternal dialogue with the diocesan superintendents.
Right.
Who are supportive and these things. So I think bringing these streams together, homeschoolers, for example, we all know, especially since COVID, the rise of homeschooling has been almost meteoric. They need to be, kind of closely aligned.
Right.
So, I think bringing all of these streams together is, there's, and there's a number of independent schools who have been around for quite a while, who are more established, and, they have something to bring to the table as well.
Yeah. I remember another diocese in which I used to live, there was an annual homeschool mass. And that was at the cathedral. And that was one of the most beautiful moments of the year for all these families to come together and be physically present with the bishop in the cathedral, and to see how all this works together. That's a beautiful thing. I want to throw a couple of things out maybe that are a little sharp. One was the idea that came up that while a common love would be the best thing to unite us, and it does in fact unite us, a love for this tradition, there's also a kind of mirror to this, which is that you can't hate progressive education enough. And that there is this, in fact, there is this enemy out there that has undermined not only classical, what you might call secular liberal education, as people knew maybe a few generations ago, but also that eventually broke into the Catholic sphere. So progressive ed is just, it is in fact an enemy, and it is out to destroy, and in some senses has destroyed many Catholic schools, and continues to poison the well in many ways. But then something else that was brought in, I think you brought this into the conversations, was that the church loves controversy.
Yeah.
So could you say a bit about both of those things? Because I think they can be misunderstood, but I think there's something to be learned from this view that progressive ed is really a problem. And you have a series of classes, a course that's available through Christendom on this. But then also the church isn't afraid of controversy and in fact embraces it. Can you say more about that?
This is a really important point. And the progressive ed movement begins in about 1890. And it really kind of takes over the public schools over the course of about 40 years. And it was highly organized in a kind of decentralized way. There's a long story to be told here that we won't tell now. But what's interesting is there's 4 streams of progressive education. People kind of think, oh, it's just footnotes to Dewey. Right. And it's not. The Deweyites lost. They're kind of, the ghost of Dewey is everywhere because he provides a usable Kantian American progressive philosophy, anthropology, but they really lost. And it was the Kantians, the behavioral psychologists who wanted to measure everything. This is 1900 now. It's very early. The industrialists who wanted factory workers, and they wanted efficiency, and they wanted schools to become factories so that they could, kind of churn out as many, organisms, or they called them units. They did. They called them units, where at least the behavioral psychologists, Edward Thorndike and Dewey, they called students, the organisms. There's no
units and organisms.
There's no sense of human nature, or all of these guys were brought up in believing Protestant homes. They all lost their faith in the late 1800s. So education fundamentally was soulless by design. And then the 4th stream that comes along is Marxism, and that comes on late 20s, early 30s. But we've got these 4 streams that are all fighting it out. Well, what brings them together? How do they manage to supplant traditional education, for example, that was cherished by the founding fathers, right? Well, what united them was a mutual antipathy for traditional education, liberal education, literature, history, the life of the mind, education that is practically oriented, but also education is its own end, right? And everyone deserves to ascend the ladder of education until he or she desires to get off of it, right? Everyone should read Shakespeare, right? Moms, poor Irish factory workers, minorities, everyone should read Shakespeare. And the progressive educator said, nope, it's a fundamentally, education has to be practical. Why? Because they had an anthropology, they had a philosophy that didn't allow anything beyond the concrete and the useful as they defined it, right? Sure. So any kind of like reading fables to children simply for the sake of wonder, that's wrong, right? Poor Irish immigrants memorizing poetry, wrong, because they don't need to do it. So this is going to distract them from problem solving and assimilating. So who's the biggest opponent of progressive education in the United States between 1900 and 1960? The Catholic Church, right? I mean, and they're, especially after Pius XI, Stavini Ilius, Fulton Sheen's in the mix. We have archbishops. We have a number of bishops in the mix. We have Jesuits, Dominicans. It's Jacques Maritain comes over in the 30s and 40s, and he provides a really, really robust philosophical basis for this criticism that's even bleeding over and influencing Protestants like Mortimer Adler before his conversion, Robert Maynard Hutchins, president of the University of Chicago. And so even the Catholics are even kind of showing the Protestants how to dissent against this. Right. Like, this can't stand. Education is about, educating the whole human person, which includes the soul, right? And the intellect, et cetera. And then in 1960, Dawson, of course, is kind of, he comes in at the tail end, and he's kind of, it's writes about the whole demise of the thing. But in the mid 60s, late 60s, we just stopped. We just simply stopped criticizing progressive ed. And everyone knew up until then that the Catholic Church was vehemently opposed to this. And so now we've essentially gone for 60 years without any robust criticism of progressive ed. Now, back to your point. Well, some might say, well, why do it? Let's just be positive and kind of present it's just merely an affirmative orthodoxy. Well, that's not the way the church has ever worked, right? Fulton Sheen said the church loves controversy, which is a kind of a shocking statement, especially for those who are at kind of conflict adverse. But why? Because Fulton Sheen gives two reasons. She loves controversy, but controversy forces her to clarify her own thinking, and the church loves rationality, right? And so not only does it refute error, but which is a work of mercy, but it also allows us to penetrate more deeply into the mystery, right? So, for example, you've studied theology. Studying theology would be simply unimaginable to study theology without studying the controversies. I mean, imagine studying church history with no Arius and no Neo-Arians or the Nestorians, because then you're essentially not reading some of the best works that have ever been written. Athanasius is on the Incarnation. Gregory Nazianzus, the five orations on the person of, on and on and on. Bellarmine, even to Newman, right? And so this is like reading, embracing controversy does not mean cable news. This is a really sophisticated and intellectual pursuit that, and the stakes are too big. So what unites a lot of times faithful Catholic streams of renewal will embrace will embrace a common philosophy of Catholic education, a theology of Catholic education, but be differentiated on smaller points. And that's what they'll focus on, is in those smaller points. Well, the progressive ed, they differed far more than we do, but yet they stayed together. Right. And they had a united front because they knew that a united front was necessary for defeating kind of traditional education. And so this idea, for example, my own experience, I started off as a young teacher 25 years ago in literacy in inner city areas. Right. And I remember there was this scourge that still exists. They're still teaching it, even though it's been proved with hundreds of studies. It's been proven to be false. This reading theory called whole language, which was kind of a modern John Dewey approach. Children learn to read organically. You set up these little stations and it's natural exposure to language. Well, it doesn't work. It was a disaster. The cognitive psych crowd has shown inconclusively this is not how we learn to read. Well, millions of poor children right now cannot read because of whole language, right? Millions. And this is one fad experiment out of 100 that we can mention. And in the series that I did, I go through and just like chuck out a number of these fads that have inundated almost all of the disciplines, right? And it's been disaster after disaster after disaster. Why? Because they have an anthropology. You can't teach human beings if you don't know what a human being is, right? And when human beings, human nature, there's a unity, an intellectual dimension, and a soul, right? And if you deny these things, and so I think back whenever I think about kind of accommodating, I think back to the kids. I actually see names and faces. I remember starting a literacy center in a very, very poor neighborhood. Because precisely I saw if kids don't learn to read by third grade, and now we could go on and on. I mean, you look at the anxiety level in schools, the mental health issues. So much of this, not all of it, is a result of these errors of progressive education, and we just simply can't hate progressive education enough. We have to hate it like Athanasius hated Arianism. We have to, because it ruins souls. It produces illiteracy. People are locked out of the job market. I mean, we're talking the natural realm and the supernatural realm. Right. I mean, it destroys the realm of grace, but it also destroys the realm of nature. And so we could go on and on about the damage that it does. And so once we focus on this, right? And for those who say, oh, this is all too pessimistic and negative, well, it's like this is what the church fathers and doctors were occupied with. Yeah. is controversy, as Fulton Sheen says. And Fulton Sheen was in the mix, criticizing progressive education. He's got a great essay on against behaviorism in education in the late 20s, early 30s. You know, so this is it's something we need to reclaim. We did this very well, and Maritain did it. Joseph Pieper did it. We need to do this more.
Yeah, no. Well, and I'm great that you spoke about all this in the way you did, because this captures the energy that animated the summit. I think this is what the summit felt like to actually be there. We had a little over 2 days of these kinds of conversations, these kinds of discussions, and this sense that there is a force out there, and has been out there for 60 years, seeking to undermine and destroy traditional Catholic education, just traditional education of any kind. And we have to come together to fight this. And it is a fight, but it's a fight we can win. And so this is really, really good. So there's not only the statement, which is available online now on our website at the college. There's also the online course. So if you want more of this information, someone listening to this wants more information, more history, you've provided that in that series of classes. So I guess one of the questions then is, well, then what's next? I mean, we've had this summit, we've got this statement. And again, even though we hosted it, and Christendom was so honored and grateful that people came together here and be part of our community for a few days, this is much, much bigger than Christendom. So what are the next steps?
Well, so the next steps, I mean, I think if I can answer that question by, kind of addressing something that you just said that was so important. And this was like, you had to be there to see this, how unified the attendees were. And I was kind of nervous coming in. You propose a joint statement. It's like, this thing could crash and burn. It's like, if you get 10 people out of 50 that want to sign it, it's over. That's not enough for consensus. Right. Land O'Lakes had 26, and they all signed it. And there was only 26, but so you don't need a lot of people, but you do need consensus. And so I told everybody, you'll remember, I said, look, there's no pressure. If we don't want to sign this, it's okay. I'll do something else with it. We'll push it out through Christendom. No pressure. And by the end of day 2, the discussions were so animated and so positive. It's hard to capture in a podcast, but everyone who could sign the statement signed it. Yeah. We had 45 signatures, and it was the level of enthusiasm is really hard to capture if you weren't there. Yeah. And there was this sense of, and I had spent even in the days coming up to it, I had people calling me saying, you got to get this in there, or I think the document's weak on this point. And so, we were up, burning the midnight oil. So what this led to, now to circle back, where does this go, is there was so much enthusiasm. Everybody was kind of saying, well, what's next? What's next? What's next? How are we going to keep these 5 groups? How are we going to keep these silos knocked down so that we can build? Right. And immediately we started talking about this, and I had ideas in mind, and depending on how the summit went, kind of an A, B, or C. But yeah, we're already having the works, which will be kind of publicizing soon, another event, various committees to keep working on these. Right. We haven't, we didn't even talk about the working groups, which did phenomenal work. And each one, we'll have produced a white paper when we're done. They have thorough notes about their discussions, and the superintendents are such leaders. They did an amazing job assisting the bishops. Each committee had a bishop and 2 superintendents who were co-chairs. They did a phenomenal job of keeping things on track and providing deliverables that'll be really, really formative for our next meetings. Yeah. George, can I say one more thing? Sure. I mean, what did we have? We had 7 Catholic colleges and universities represented. Yeah. And we invited every higher ed Catholic institution that's involved in kind of graduate level teacher formation, right? They're working to train teachers at a graduate level and really attentive, not to progressive ed and the culture of Uber assessment and all the latest things that come now. We're on social emotional learning and, all this child-centered stuff, however it manifests itself. But graduate programs who are really thinking deeply about training teachers according to the mind and the tradition of the church, and especially the documents that we have from 1885 to the present day to Pope Leo.
The programs that are really leading the renewal.
Yeah, exactly.
Essentially, it's not enough just to have a graduate program, but you've got to be actively thinking about this and be out front in terms of the renewal movement of Catholic education.
Exactly. And so this was, we obviously, if you're going to have 50 people, you can't invite every Catholic college and university. But we invited all the ones who were leading the renewal, and great scholars came, and they took a lead in helping to craft some of these. You can look at the signers and see who was there. But it was fantastic. And so I think that even bringing, and I've gotten emails from these various colleges all saying, what's next? I mean, long emails, like, hey, I know you're just catching your breath, but what's next? Consider us partners. We want to work together. And so this is fantastic because there can be this sense of competition. We're all, these amongst faithful Catholic colleges, we're all, kind of, trying to, fish for the same pool of, small pool of fish. And it's like, no, if we work together, we can do greater things to truly restore all things in Christ.
Yeah. Well, and I mentioned that I communicated with a bishop last week who was planning to use this document in discussions with teachers. My wife was actually at a wedding this past weekend. And someone who was also traveling in from out of town is a teacher at a Catholic school, and said that she'd already heard about this document through her bishop.
Yeah.
And was incredibly excited, especially the fact that it distilled so much of what she'd learned already, but it also kind of opened the path to future learning. And so we're hoping that this is going to be kind of a point, not so much the culmination of something as a point of departure that we can look back on in 10 or 20 years and say, this is when things really came together in a way to both continue the great renewal that's happening in so many private institutions and homeschooling programs and a select number of Catholic diocesan schools, but also that it can spread. And we basically can retake Catholic K-12 education across the entire country.
Yeah.
And make it really strongly Catholic in every way, which is what those generations of parents, grandparents, great-grandparents sacrificed to build. They built those schools, and they entrusted their kids to those schools. And it's not the Catholic way, as a colleague of mine once said, to abandon something. It's the Catholic way to redeem it.
Yeah.
And I think we could call it a renewal movement, but we could also call it a movement of redemption. Mm-hmm. And that's, I think, part of why that energy was so high in that room. This is just beginning. And we're building on something that's been going on for decades and decades and decades, often in the shadows, often in the margins. But this coming together is a new inflection point. And it's incredibly exciting. So thank you, I will say, on behalf of all of us who were there, for all that you put into this.
You're welcome. You're welcome. It was a real pleasure. And it was, at some point, we were all just kind of being swept along because the mood was so high.
Yeah.
And so, I think that, you're absolutely right. I mean, our grandparents and great grandparents have built this under the direction of our bishops since the bishops' Third Plenary Council in 1884, right? When they saw all of the crisis of American education and the common schools and the anti-Catholic discrimination. And as Bishop Daly says so eloquently in his preamble, now we're at a new crisis, and we need to answer the call just like the bishops did in 1884. And a lot of times we have this sense of like, well, the institutions are lost or we can't do this. I mean, look, that is not true. I mean, the left wing Marxist who wrote the book on marching through the institutions, Gramsci, right, the Italian, when exactly 100 years ago, he was in prison and he was thinking about this question of how do we take the institutions? And what was he thinking about? What was his inspiration for how to do this well? The Catholic Church. Right. He said, nobody's done this better than the Catholic Church in terms of training and teaching and codifying doctrine and propagating it and providing a bulwark. And he said, Marxists need to study the church. It's like, okay, there's no way. If they can do it, like they took inspiration from us, we can do this. And one of the things, if I could add one thing, one of the big problems is that our poor teachers are so overwhelmed, and teacher turnover is really high. It's 15 to 20% or in some cases a year. And teachers are overwhelmed. And it's a question of sometimes a curriculum that is very onerous and burdensome. There's all of these demands in terms of outcomes and assessment and standards. And they're a lot of times they're given no, because their licensure programs force them into state-run education schools. And so they're getting all of this child-centered, pedagogy, which makes it difficult because it doesn't really teach you how to teach, right? It teaches you, all of this abstract progressive theory about what this organic, classroom should look like that models life. And, it's everything is just really fruitful and interesting group work. And, and they're burdened and they get burned out and they can't handle it. And so these principles are for them as well, because they're the heroes, really. They're in the trenches and we want them to go back and to give them a reminder. They don't have the time to go back and start kind of trudging through all of these beautiful documents on education that we have. A lot of times they don't have the theological formation. So these principles are especially for our teachers to remind them of their first love, to remind them of their high calling. Pope Pius XI, in his document on catechesis in 1935, which he writes on the 30th anniversary of a document on catechesis that Pius X writes, and he says something to the effect of like Catholic schools or kind of catechetical programs or something. They need to be they need to be wisdom crying in the streets.
Wow.
Wisdom crying in the streets, and that's what our schools need to be. Right. We need to see ourselves as, the voice of wisdom crying in the streets, and our Catholic teachers who are so beleaguered and exhausted and burned out and they're underpaid and et cetera, et cetera. And they need to remember of, the great dignity of their calling and how essential they really are. Yeah. And they are, kind of the clarions, right, in this idea that schools should be, the voice of wisdom crying in the streets. Yeah. And so I hope this document, and many people I've gotten, have emailed me and said, somebody said, not only is this effective, but it's beautiful as well. I've heard this a number of times. It reads really well. It was like, you could tell there was a lot of really educated hands in writing it because it's inspirational, which is rare for like a working joint statement, which is usually, And so we hope that this inspires our teachers as well, and inspires parents, principals to look, education doesn't have to be like this. It's not supposed to be like this. Yeah. And we've got 2,000 years of thinking through how do you educate human beings. We have a wealth, we have a treasury to draw on for reforming and renewing our Catholic schools.
Yeah, that's great. So for those who want to know more, obviously the place to start would be to begin with the Front Royal Statement, which is available on our website. The next place would be the free online course that you offered that anybody can take, a series of classes that take you sort of through the problem, like the problem of progressive ed, but then also you end on the solution. And then if you want even more, I mentioned at the very beginning that you're director of the Center for Educational Philosophy and Leadership here at the college. And we have 2 degree programs that are offered there, both the Masters of Ed and the Doctorate in Education. And for those who want to move into leadership positions, those are the ideal degrees because they check the boxes for the job searches that are often conducted and what's required in terms of credential. But those degrees are not based on Dewey. They're not Dewey with a bit of catechism sprinkled on top. They're actually thoroughly renewal degrees. And so all 3 of those levels are places people can enter into the larger project. So anyway, thank you again. It's an honor to work alongside you in this great renewal, and thank you for working so hard on this summit and also the statement, and for bringing so many great people to the college.
It's a pleasure, Dr. Harne. Thanks so much for having me.
All right, take care. Thanks.
Bye.
Thank you for listening to Christendom Conversations. If you enjoyed this episode, be sure to subscribe and leave a review on your favorite podcast platform. To learn more about Christendom College and its mission, visit us at christendom.edu. Until next time, may we all continue to seek the truth, live the faith, and restore all things in Christ. God bless.